Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be reviewing the performance of number 65, Erik Karlsson. Now, the Sharks acquired Erik Karlsson in what was arguably the biggest move of this past offseason, only really rivaled by the acquisition of John Tavares by the Toronto Maple Leafs, but my opinion is that because Erik Karlsson was acquired through trade instead of just through a signing, this was likely the biggest move of that offseason, and the Sharks were the ones who came out with the best player in the trade, of course. And Erik Karlsson was supposed to be this player who would put the Sharks over the top, and in the end, that was almost the case. The Sharks were much better with Erik Karlsson than they would have been without him. But it didn't really start off like that. Erik Karlsson, through the first 20 or so games of the season, wasn't that great. His defense actually left a lot to be desired, and his offensive game, while solid, was nowhere near what it was expected to be and what it was when he was with the Ottawa Senators. But something seemed to click at the start of December, as it did with the Sharks as a team, and certainly no coincidence that Erik Karlsson really got into gear at the same time as the Sharks, obviously, and he ends up putting up a 14-game assist streak. Technically, there was a suspension in between that, so the NHL might not consider it a full assist streak, but it really was, and that was, one of the best streaks of its kind for a defenseman in NHL history, basically, and he was performing so much better during this middle part of the season for the San Jose Sharks. Unfortunately, though, he ends up going down with a groin injury that makes him miss the majority of the rest of the regular season, and while he did play in the playoffs, he was very clearly injured during those games. Now, his frequent line mates on the season, in both the his frequent pairing in the regular season and the playoffs, were with Brendan Dillon. Now, Erik Karlsson was likely acquired with the possibility of playing with Marc-Edouard Vlasic in mind, but that pairing never really worked out as a duo, and so Karlsson found himself with Brendan Dillon, and that is where he had the majority of his success. In the regular season, he played just 53 games due to that groin injury that he had, also due to the couple games of suspension, yet he still managed to acquire 3 goals, 42 assists for 45 points. As I said, his offense wasn't that great during the first 2 months, and yet his play after that point was so incredibly impressive that he still ended up 6th in the league in terms of points per game from defensemen, actually behind Brent Burns, who led the way for defensemen this year. He was also a +6, which was a massive recovery from how he started the season, where he was near the bottom, at times reaching below -10 in terms of plus-minus rating. He also had 20 power play points, which is, of course, impressive, as well as 24 minutes and 29 seconds of time on ice, putting him just about 30-40 seconds behind Brent Burns, who had just over 25 minutes. In the playoffs, he played 19 games, almost every single one, as he ended up leaving Game 5 against the St. Louis Blues somewhat early, having only played about 10 minutes, and then did not play Game 6 against the Blues. But he still had, even during this massive injury that he dealt with during the playoffs, 2 goals, 14 assists for 16 points. He was also only a -3, not fantastic, but for someone who was playing through his condition, it's still somewhat impressive, I guess, that it wasn't lower than that, especially when you're playing against teams like the Golden Knights and like the Avalanche, very strong offensive teams. He also had 6 power play points, which was nice to see, as well as 24 minutes and 45 seconds. But you can see that DeBoer did go a lot easier on Erik Karlsson during the playoffs than he did during the regular season. His ice time only went up by 16 seconds, which for one of the Sharks' top defensemen during the playoffs, when the Sharks were only really running 5 defensemen, since Joakim Ryan was only getting a handful of minutes a night, it is pretty surprising. And you take a look at the specifics in terms of ice time. In the regular season, Erik Karlsson was second in even strength. He found himself 3rd in even strength ice time in the playoffs, behind Marc-Edouard Vlasic even. And in shorthanded ice time, while in both the regular season and the playoffs, he was 4th of the top 4 defensemen for the Sharks: Braun, Vlasic, Burns, and himself. He was only about 10-ish seconds behind 3rd place during the regular season, while in the playoffs he found himself a good minute behind 3rd place for shorthanded ice time. So it was really only his power play ice time in the playoffs that went up substantially. So it showed that Erik Karlsson was given somewhat easier minutes than he was during the regular season, not because the Sharks didn't really trust him as a whole to play in those tougher minutes because of his play itself, but because of the fact that he was dealing with that injury. And while we don't know really the extent of it, we definitely know that it affected his game pretty severely. For his grades on the year, in the first quarter, he was given a C+, which might have been a bit nice for how Erik Karlsson actually did perform during that first quarter, but he did bring it back near the end of it. His second quarter was superb, getting the grade of an A. The third quarter, an A-. Sadly, the fourth quarter, there is no grade because of the fact that he missed the majority of those games. And in the playoffs, he ended up getting a B+, which was good enough for the final grade of a B+ as well. We'll see how Erik Karlsson can perform this coming season. He's on a massive new contract, 8 years, $11.5 million per year. We know he's going to be with the Sharks at least for the next, it's planned to be for the next 8 years. While this past season, Erik Karlsson could have been a bit more uncertain about his future, so he's definitely a lot more settled in. And barring injury, it should be a very, very good season for Erik Karlsson and by extension, the San Jose Sharks. Class dismissed.